The little girl's voice came first before anything else, before the dust, before the sun, before the silence that would swallow everything whole. Just a whisper barely louder than a breath floating up from somewhere deep inside a memory that hadn't happened yet. Be my mama, 3 words. That was all. 3 words spoken by a child who had already learned what it meant to lose the one person who was supposed to stay forever. 3 words that would change everything. But not yet. Not for a long time yet. First there was the train. The locomotive pulled away from the platform in a shuddering groan of iron and steam, dragging its long body eastward like some great beast retreating from the sun. The smoke it left behind hung low and thick, curling around the wooden posts of the station house before the wind caught it and tore it apart. And when the smoke cleared, there was only a girl standing alone on the platform with a carpet bag clutched in both hands and a letter folded in her pocket that had promised her the world. Vivian Lockhart was 18 years old. She had traveled 800 miles on hard wooden benches through 3 states and 2 sleepless nights to reach this place. She had worn her only good dress, a simple gray cotton with ivory buttons she had polished that morning with a damp cloth, and a kind of desperate hope that looking respectable might be enough to make a man keep his word. It was not enough. Orrin Sutley had studied her face for less than 30 seconds. He stood at the far end of the platform, a tall man in a brown coat with dust on his boots and something cold and final in his expression. He looked at her the way a man looks at a horse he has decided not to buy. Not with cruelty exactly, but with a kind of flat, practical dismissal that made her feel like an object weighed and found wanting. Then he turned his back. He walked away without a word, without an explanation, without so much as a nod of acknowledgement that she existed at all. He simply left, and Vivian stood there watching him go, her fingers turning white around the handle of her carpet bag, the Montana sun beating down on her shoulders like a punishment she had not earned. Would you have stayed or run? Drop a comment with where you are watching from so I can see how far Vivian's story reaches. And stay with me, because what happens next to this girl abandoned under the summer sun is something you will not forget. The platform emptied quickly. The other passengers disappeared into waiting carriages or walked toward town with purpose and direction people who had somewhere to be someone waiting for them. The station agent retreated into his little office and closed the door. The sound of that latch clicking shut was the loneliest sound Vivian had ever heard. She stood motionless. The only noise left was the wind scraping across the wooden planks and the distant lowing of cattle from the stockyards beyond the fence. She had imagined this moment 100 times during the long journey west. In her mind, Orrin Sutley would be waiting with a kind smile, maybe wildflowers, some gentle word of welcome. She had pictured herself stepping into a new life with dignity, with hope. She had imagined safety. Instead, she received a single cold glance and a turned back. The letter was still in her pocket. She had memorized every line. I am a man of modest means, but steady character. I seek a wife who values honesty and hard work. If you are willing, I will meet you at the station on the 15th of June. It was the 15th of June. He had met her. He just decided she was not worth keeping. Vivian forced herself to breathe. She forced herself to think. Steep Creek, Montana, was not much of a town. A single main street lined with weathered storefronts. A mercantile with a faded awning. A saloon with a crooked sign and piano music leaking through its swinging doors. A church steeple rising like a white needle against the endless blue sky. Beyond all of it, nothing but rolling prairie and distant mountains shimmering in the heat. Beautiful, vast, completely indifferent to the girl standing alone on the platform with $17 in her pocket and nowhere in the world to go. $17. Every cent she had saved working in her aunt's boarding house back in Dayton, Ohio. 2 years of scrubbing floors and changing linens and serving meals to strangers who never looked at her twice. 2 years of tucking coins into a tin box hidden beneath a loose floorboard while her aunt's voice carried through the walls, sharp and constant, and always finding fault. You are slow, Vivian. You are careless. You are nothing like your mother, and thank God for that, because your mother had no sense either. Her mother had died when Vivian was 7. Typhoid fever. It came on a Tuesday, and by Friday, she was gone. Her father had followed 6 months later, not from illness, but from the slow, quiet collapse of a man who simply could not find a reason to keep breathing without the woman he loved. Vivian remembered standing at his graveside in a black dress 2 sizes too big, holding the hand of an aunt who had taken her in, not out of love, but out of obligation, and who never once let her forget the difference. $17 was not enough for a ticket home. It was not enough for a week's lodging. It was not enough for anything except delaying the inevitable. But Vivian had learned a long time ago that survival was not about having enough. It was about refusing to stop moving when everything told you to lie down. She set the carpet bag at her feet and pressed her palms together, willing her hands to stop shaking. Think. You have to think. But the heat made thinking difficult. The sun was merciless, bleaching the color from the sky, glaring off the metal rails until they shimmered. Sweat gathered at the nape of her neck and soaked into the high collar of her dress. The fabric clung to her skin, heavy and suffocating. A shadow moved at the edge of her vision. Vivian turned sharply and saw 3 men loitering near the stockyard fence about 50 yards away. They were not looking at her directly, but they were not looking away either. Drifters, maybe. Cowhands between jobs. One of them spat into the dust and said something low that made the others laugh. Vivian picked up her carpet bag and started walking toward the main street, her gaze fixed straight ahead, her steps measured and deliberate. The Mercantile was the closest building. If she could just reach it, if she could step inside and ask about work or lodging or anything at all that might give her a foothold in this place. "Afternoon, miss." The voice came from behind her, close enough to make her flinch. She stopped but did not turn. "You waiting for someone?" The tone was casual, friendly even, but there was something underneath it. Amusement, curiosity, the particular interest of men who have spotted something unprotected. "I am fine, thank you," Vivian said quietly, and kept walking. Footsteps followed. 2 sets, maybe 3. "You sure about that?" "You look a little lost." Her heart hammered. The Mercantile was still 30 yards away. Too far. She glanced sideways and saw 2 of the men fanning out, slightly cutting off her angles. Not threatening. Not yet. Just closing in. "I said, I am fine." Her voice came out sharper this time, and she hated how it wavered at the end. Now that is not very friendly. The first man stepped into her peripheral vision. Tall, unshaven, a stained hat pulled low. "We are just being neighborly, offering help to a lady in need." Vivian stopped walking. She turned to face them, gripping her carpet bag with both hands. "I do not need help." The man grinned. His teeth were yellow. You sure? Because it looked like somebody left you standing on that platform all by yourself. That does not seem right. Her face burned. He had been watching. They had all been watching. Leave me alone, she said, and was mortified when her voice cracked. The second man laughed, a short, ugly sound. We are just talking, miss. No harm in talking. But they were closer now, close enough that she could smell whiskey and sweat, close enough that running would be useless. Step back. The voice was low and steady and came from somewhere to her left. All three men turned. A man stood near the corner of the station house, holding a sleeping child against his shoulder. He was not large, maybe just under 6 feet, lean and weathered, with sun-darkened skin and pale blue eyes that looked almost colorless in the bright light. He wore work clothes, a battered hat, and an expression of absolute calm. But there was something in the way he held himself. Something still and unyielding, like a fence post driven so deep into the ground that no wind could move it. This is not your business, Renfield, the tall man said. It is now. The man called Renfield shifted slightly, adjusting the child's weight against his shoulder, without taking his eyes off the three men. Walk away. We were not doing nothing. I said, walk away. The silence stretched thin. The child stirred in his arms, murmuring something soft and sleepy. He touched her back, gently soothing her without looking down. It was such a small gesture, so natural and practiced, that Vivian felt something catch in her chest. The tall drifter spat into the dirt. Fine. Was not worth the trouble anyway. He jerked his head at the others, and they drifted off toward the saloon, muttering as they went. Vivian watched them go. Her pulse was still racing. Her hands were shaking so badly she had to clench them into fists to hide it. The man called Renfield waited until the drifters disappeared inside the saloon. Then he turned to her. You all right? She nodded, then shook her head. Then felt tears prick hot and humiliating at the corners of her eyes, and nodded again. Yes, thank you. He studied her for a moment, not the way Orrin Sutley had with cold judgment, but with something closer to quiet assessment, the kind of look a man gives when he is trying to understand a situation before deciding what to do about it. His eyes moved to the carpet bag, to the empty platform behind her, to the train tracks stretching east. You waiting for someone? No. The word came out flat and final. Not anymore. He did not press, just nodded slowly, as if that answered enough. The child in his arms shifted again, and Vivian caught a glimpse of her face. A little girl, maybe 5 or 6, with tangled blonde hair and flushed cheeks, deeply asleep, her small hand curled against the man's chest. Is she all right? Vivian asked softly. Just tired. We have been in town since dawn. He paused. I am Silas Renfield. This is my daughter Nell, Vivian Lockhart. Silas nodded once, a small acknowledgement. Then he looked past her toward the town, the empty street, the long stretch of prairie beyond. When he spoke again, his voice was careful. You got somewhere to go. Vivian thought about lying, thought about saying she had family waiting, a plan, a future that did not involve standing stranded in the middle of Montana with $17 and nowhere to sleep. But she was too tired for lies, too tired for pride. No, she said. Silas was quiet for a long moment. Nell stirred and made a small sound of protest, and he shifted her weight again, his movements practiced and gentle. Finally, he looked back at Vivian. I have got a ranch about an hour north of here. Just me and Nell. I could use some help around the house. Cooking, cleaning, looking after her when I am working. It is temporary, just until you figure out what you want to do next." Vivian stared at him. "You do not know me." "No," Silas agreed. "But you are stranded and I need help. Seems like a fair trade." It was not a fair trade. They both knew it. He was offering her shelter, safety, a lifeline she had no right to expect. And he was asking for nothing in return except work she had been doing her entire life. Why, she asked quietly. Silas glanced down at Nell, then back at Vivian. "Because leaving you here is not right." It was the simplest answer in the world, and maybe the only one that mattered. Vivian took a breath. "All right." Silas's wagon was parked behind the general store. An old functional thing with worn wooden sides and a team of 2 sturdy horses waiting in the shade. He settled Nell into a nest of blankets in the back, tucking a small quilt around her shoulders, even though the air was sweltering. The child did not wake. Vivian climbed onto the bench seat beside him and set her carpet bag at her feet. Silas took up the reins, clicked his tongue softly, and the horses started forward. They left Steep Creek behind in silence. The road north was little more than a pair of wagon ruts cutting through the prairie, winding past fields of wild grass that rippled like water in the wind. The sky stretched endlessly overhead, so blue it ached to look at. In the distance, the mountains rose dark and jagged, their peaks still touched with snow, even in the heat of summer. Vivian had never seen so much space. Back in Ohio, the world had felt narrow and cramped. Small rooms, crowded streets, the constant press of people who never noticed you. Here the silence was so vast it made her ears ring. Silas did not speak. He kept his eyes on the road, his posture relaxed but alert. Vivian studied him from the corner of her eye. The strong line of his jaw. The calluses thick on his hands. The way he held the reins with an easy, unconscious competence. He looked like a man who had spent his whole life working under the sun. Weathered, steady, lonely maybe. "How old is she?" Vivian asked, finally nodding toward Nell. 6. Just turned 6 last month. She is beautiful." A flicker crossed his face, something between pride and pain. "She looks like her mother." Vivian went still. Past tense. "Looks like her mother." "I am sorry," she said quietly. Silas did not respond. They rode in silence for another mile. Then Nell stirred in the back, murmuring something soft, and Silas glanced over his shoulder to check on her. His expression softened in a way that made Vivian's chest ache. "She does not remember her much," he said quietly. "Ruth, my wife. She died when Nell was 2. Fever. It came on fast." Vivian's hands tightened in her lap. "That must have been hard." "It was." His voice was flat. "Factual. Still is. Some days." He did not say anything else, and Vivian did not push. She understood grief. Understood the way it sat quiet and heavy in your chest like a stone you learned to carry but never quite got used to. The ranch appeared slowly rising out of the prairie like something planted and stubborn. A 2-story house with a covered porch. A barn, a few smaller outbuildings, and a corral where horses grazed in the shade. Everything looked solid and well kept, but tired, like it had been built by someone who cared deeply and then left to endure alone. Silas pulled the wagon to a stop near the house and set the brake. Nell was awake now, blinking sleepily, rubbing her eyes with small fists. When she saw Vivian, she went very still. Wide blue eyes, uncertain, almost frightened. "Nell, this is Miss Lockhart," Silas said gently. "She is going to be staying with us for a while, helping out around the house." Nell did not answer. She stared at Vivian with the unblinking intensity of a child trying to decide whether a stranger was safe. Vivian offered a small smile. "Hello, Nell." The little girl buried her face against her father's shoulder. Silas sighed softly and lifted her down from the wagon. "She is shy with strangers. Give her time." Vivian nodded, though something in her chest twisted at the word. Stranger. That was exactly what she was. A stranger in someone else's home, someone else's life. Inside the house was simple but clean. Whitewashed walls, wooden floors worn smooth by years of boots, a stone fireplace, a worn sofa, a table with 2 chairs. Beyond that, a small kitchen with a cast iron stove and shelves lined with mismatched dishes. Upstairs, Silas showed her a narrow room with a bed washstand and a single window overlooking the prairie. "It is not much," he said. "It is more than I had an hour ago," Vivian said quietly. Silas paused in the doorway. His hand rested on the frame, and she noticed for the first time that there was a lock on the inside of the door, a small brass bolt recently installed, the screws still bright. He had put it there, for her, before he even knew who she would be. He did not mention it. He simply said, "I will leave you to settle in. Supper is around 6, nothing fancy." Then he closed the door softly behind him. Vivian stood alone in the small room, her carpet bag still clutched in her hand. Slowly, she set it down and sank onto the edge of the bed. The mattress was thin but clean. The room smelled faintly of sage and dust. Through the window, the prairie stretched to the horizon, golden and infinite and completely empty. She should have felt relief, gratitude, safety. Instead, she felt hollow. Because this was not a new beginning. It was just another place where she did not belong. Another borrowed room. Another temporary arrangement that would end the way everything in her life had ended, with someone deciding she was not worth keeping. Vivian pressed her palms to her eyes and breathed. Outside, the wind moved through the grass with a sound like whispering. Downstairs, she could hear Silas's boots on the wooden floor and Nell's small voice asking something she could not quite make out. She lowered her hands and looked at the carpet bag sitting on the floor beside her feet. Everything she owned in the world fit inside that single worn bag. Every possession, every memory, every remnant of the life she had left behind. It was not much. It was nothing, really. But she was still here. She was still breathing. And tomorrow she would get up and she would work. And she would make herself useful. Because that was what she had always done. That was all she knew how to do. Vivian did not open the carpet bag that night. She simply lay back on the narrow bed, still wearing her gray dress with its polished ivory buttons, and stared at the ceiling while the Montana sky darkened outside her window, and the stars came out one by one like distant, indifferent witnesses to everything she had lost. Tomorrow, she told herself, tomorrow you will figure out what comes next. But somewhere deep in her chest, beneath the exhaustion and the fear and the stubborn refusal to give up, a small voice whispered what she was not yet ready to hear. You are already home. You just do not know it yet. Supper that first evening was quiet in the way only a house full of strangers can be quiet. Not hostile, not cold, just careful. The particular silence of people who have not yet learned where the edges of each other are. Vivian had come downstairs at 6 o'clock exactly and found Silas already at the stove, his movements efficient but graceless. He had made beans and salt pork and cornbread, the kind of meal a man learns to cook when there is no one else to do it. Simple, functional, enough to keep a body going and nothing more. Nell sat across the table from Vivian with her eyes fixed on her plate, sneaking glances when she thought no one was looking. Each time Vivian caught her, the little girl dropped her gaze instantly, her cheeks flushing pink. She ate with small, precise bites, pushing her beans into a neat row along the edge of her plate before consuming them one by one. "This is good," Vivian said softly. "Thank you." Silas nodded without looking up. "You will be doing the cooking from now on, if that is all right." "Of course." Another silence. Vivian focused on her food, acutely aware of how strange this was. Sitting at a table with two people she did not know, in a house that was not hers, pretending this was normal, pretending she was not terrified. After supper, Silas took Nell upstairs. Vivian cleared the table and washed the dishes, her hands moving automatically through the familiar motions. The water was lukewarm. The soap was harsh and yellow. Outside the window, the sun was finally setting, painting the sky in shades of amber and pale rose. The heat was beginning to ease. When Silas came back downstairs, he found Vivian standing on the porch, her arms wrapped around herself, staring out at the prairie. She asleep, out like a light. Silas leaned against the porch rail. His gaze followed hers toward the horizon where the last light was bleeding out of the sky. "She will warm up to you. Just takes her a while. I understand." They stood in silence. Then Silas said, "You do not have to tell me what happened, but if you need anything, supplies, help getting to another town, just say so." Vivian turned to look at him. His face was shadowed in the fading light. Unreadable. "Why are you doing this?" she asked quietly. Silas was quiet for a long time. A coyote called somewhere in the distance, and another answered from farther away, their voices thin and mournful in the gathering dark. "Because I know what it is like to be alone," he said. "And I would not wish that on anyone." Vivian's throat tightened. She looked away, blinking hard against the sting in her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. Silas nodded. Then he pushed off the rail and went back inside, leaving her alone beneath the wide Montana sky with its million indifferent stars and the sound of wind moving through grass that stretched on forever in every direction. The days settled into a rhythm after that. Vivian awoke before dawn each morning and lit the fire in the stove. She made coffee, strong and black the way she had seen Silas drink it that first evening, and set out breakfast. Eggs, bacon, biscuits when there was time. Silas ate quickly and headed out to work, and then the house belonged to Vivian, and she filled it the only way she knew how, with labor. She scrubbed the floors until the wood shone pale as bone. She beat the dust from the curtains and hung them back in windows so clean the glass seemed to disappear. She reorganized the kitchen, the pantry, the linen cupboard. She mended shirts and patched trousers and darned socks with stitches so small and even they were nearly invisible. She did all of this with a kind of desperate energy that she recognized distantly as fear. If she was useful enough, if she worked hard enough, if she made herself indispensable, then maybe they would keep her. Maybe she would not be sent away again. She had learned this arithmetic early in her aunt's boarding house. Your value was what you produced. Your safety was what you earned. The moment you stopped being useful was the moment you became disposable. And so Vivian worked. She worked until her hands were raw and her back ached and the house gleamed around her like something polished for sale. Nell followed her everywhere. The little girl did not speak much during those first days, but she watched with an intensity that was almost unnerving. She sat on the porch steps while Vivian hung laundry, her blue eyes tracking every movement. She stood in the kitchen doorway while Vivian kneaded bread, her small body perfectly still, her expression grave and watchful. She trailed Vivian through the rooms of the house like a quiet, golden-haired ghost who had not yet decided whether to trust the living. On the third morning, Vivian turned from the stove and found Nell standing directly behind her, so close that she nearly tripped over the child. She caught herself on the edge of the counter, her heart jumping. "Nell," she said, gently crouching down to the little girl's level. "You do not have to follow me everywhere. You can play or read or sit on the porch if you like. I will be right here." Nell stared at her with those wide blue eyes, eyes that held far more knowledge than any 6-year-old should possess. The knowledge of loss, the understanding that people leave and sometimes they do not come back. "Are you going to leave?" Nell whispered. Vivian's heart clenched. "What are you going to leave?" "Like Mama." The words hit Vivian like a fist. She reached out slowly and took Nell's small hand in hers. The child's fingers were warm and sticky with something that might have been jam. "I am not your mama, sweetheart, but I am not going anywhere. Not yet. Promise." Vivian hesitated. She did not know how long she would stay, did not know what tomorrow held or the day after that. But looking into this child's frightened, hopeful face, she could not bring herself to say anything except the truth the little girl needed to hear. "I promise," Vivian said softly. Nell's shoulders relaxed. She did not smile, but she squeezed Vivian's hand once very gently before letting go and retreating to her usual spot in the kitchen doorway. And Vivian turned back to the stove and pressed her hand against her chest where something had cracked open that she did not yet have a name for. That evening, Vivian made cornbread to go with supper. She made it the way she had always made it, the way she had learned in her aunt's kitchen, shaping the batter into a round loaf in a cast-iron skillet and baking it until the top was golden and the edges crisp. She set it on the table beside the beans and the salt pork and the pickled vegetables she had found in the root cellar. Silas sat down, said a brief, quiet grace, and reached for the cornbread. He broke off a piece and brought it to his mouth, and then his hand stopped. He stared at the bread in his fingers. His jaw tightened. Something moved behind his eyes, something deep and private and wounded, and for a moment he looked like a man who had been struck. "Is something wrong?" Vivian asked, her stomach dropping. Silas put the bread in his mouth and chewed slowly. Swallowed. His expression smoothed back into its usual careful blankness, but not before Vivian caught the edge of something raw beneath it. "It is fine," he said quietly. "Ruth used to make it round like that." Then he pushed his chair back and walked out to the porch without finishing his meal. Vivian sat at the table in the sudden silence, the cornbread cooling between them, and understood that she had just touched a wound she could not see. That this house was full of invisible wounds. That the woman who had lived here before her had left marks everywhere in the pattern of dishes on the shelves in the curtains she had chosen. In the way a round loaf of cornbread could stop a grown man mid-bite and send him fleeing from his own kitchen. She did not make the cornbread round again after that. The heat continued through the second week and into the third. The sun was a hammer, and the prairie was an anvil, and everything between felt like it was being beaten flat. The creek that ran along the eastern edge of the property shrank to a muddy trickle. The grasses turned brittle and gold. Even the horses moved slowly, their heads low, their tails flicking listlessly at flies. Vivian kept the house as cool as she could, closing the shutters during the hottest hours, airing rooms at dawn and dusk. She learned more about the rhythms of the household with each passing day. Silas liked his coffee without sugar. Nell would only eat vegetables if they were cut very small and mixed with something else. Silas came in at dusk with his shirt soaked through and his hands raw, but he never complained, never mentioned the heat or the long hours or the weight of running a ranch alone. Ruth had died when Nell was 2. The fever came fast. That was all Silas had said, and Vivian did not push because she understood grief, and she understood the way some men build walls so thick and high that pushing against them only makes them stronger. But she noticed things. She noticed that Silas worked too hard, that he came in exhausted and ate standing up sometimes as though sitting down might mean he would not be able to get up again. She noticed that Nell had nightmares, that the child woke in the dark hours crying for her mother with a sound so small and desolate it made Vivian's chest ache through the wall between their rooms. She noticed that this house, for all its order and cleanliness, was a place built on absence. 2 people living around the shape of someone who was gone. And Vivian noticed something else. She noticed that she was trying too hard, that she said yes to everything anticipated, every need, never sat down. When Silas was standing, never took a second helping, never expressed a preference or a desire of her own. She was performing usefulness with every breath, auditioning constantly for a role she was terrified of losing. And somewhere beneath the frantic labor was the old familiar belief that had been planted in her bones since childhood. You must earn your place. Nothing is given freely. The moment you stop being needed is the moment you are sent away. Silas noticed it too. She was not sure how or when, but one evening, as she was scrubbing the kitchen floor for the second time that day, he appeared in the doorway and stood there watching her with an expression she could not read. Vivian. She looked up startled. A strand of hair had come loose from her braid and hung across her flushed face. You do not have to earn your place here, Silas said quietly. The floor is clean. It was clean this morning. You can stop. Vivian's hand tightened on the brush. Something in his voice, the gentleness of it, the way he said it without judgment or pity, made her throat close up. I like to keep busy, she managed. There is a difference between keeping busy and punishing yourself. Silas paused. You are safe here. You do not have to prove anything. He left the doorway and she heard his boots on the porch, and then the creak of the rocking chair and the slow rhythm of it moving back and forth in the evening air. Vivian sat on the wet floor with the brush still in her hand and blinked at the space where he had been standing and felt something shift inside her. A hairline fracture in the wall she had built around herself. So small she almost missed it. But it was there. She did not scrub the floor again the next day. Slowly, carefully, Vivian began to fill the house with something other than labor. She baked bread and left it cooling on the counter so the kitchen smelled of yeast and warmth when Silas came in from the fields. She mended Nell's dresses with care, adding small touches, a tighter hem here, a stronger seam there, the kind of invisible repairs that spoke of attention rather than obligation. She hummed while she worked, soft melodies her mother had taught her before the fever took her, songs Vivian had not thought about in years that came floating back to her now in this quiet house on the edge of the world. She did not realize Nell was listening until one afternoon when she was hanging sheets on the line behind the house and heard a small voice joining in, thin and uncertain, but perfectly on key. Vivian turned and found Nell standing barefoot in the grass, her golden hair catching the sunlight, humming the melody Vivian had been singing. Their eyes met. Nell stopped immediately, her face going pink. But Vivian smiled at her and kept humming, and after a moment the little girl joined in again, and they hung the rest of the laundry together in a duet so quiet the wind almost swallowed it. That night, Silas came in for supper and stopped in the doorway. Vivian was at the stove. Nell was setting the table, carefully placing each fork and knife with the grave concentration of a child performing important work. The kitchen was warm with the smell of stew and biscuits. There were wildflowers in a jar on the table. Nell had picked them that afternoon and presented them to Vivian with a solemnity that made her want to cry. Silas stood in the doorway and looked at the table, at his daughter chattering about the flowers and the birds she had seen on the fence post, and how many biscuits she was allowed to eat. At Vivian moving through his kitchen with an ease that made the room look different, not changed exactly, just filled. His eyes met Vivian's across the room. Something passed between them, something complicated and fragile and unspoken, something that made Vivian's heart beat faster and her face grow warm and her hands fumble briefly with the lid of the pot. Then Nell said, "Papa, you are letting the bugs in," and Silas blinked and stepped inside and closed the door, and the moment passed. But it had been there. They both knew it had been there. This was not her home, but it was starting to feel like it could be. The heat broke on a Thursday morning in late June, but not in the way anyone would have wanted. Vivian woke to the sound of coughing, not the ordinary cough of dust or dry air. This was deeper, hollow, the sound of something struggling to pull air through passages that did not want to cooperate. It came through the wall between her room and Nell's, and it sent ice through Vivian's veins before she was fully conscious. She threw off her sheet and ran down the hall. Nell's door was open. The little girl was curled on her side, her face flushed the color of a sunset, her hair plastered to her forehead with sweat. Her nightgown was damp and twisted around her small body. When Vivian pressed her palm to Nell's cheek, the heat was shocking, like pressing your hand against a stove. "Nell, sweetheart, can you hear me?" Nell's eyes fluttered open, glassy, unfocused, swimming with fever. "I am cold," she whimpered. Her teeth chattered even as her skin burned. Vivian's heart hammered. The room was stifling the air, thick and still. "I am going to get your papa. I will be right back." She found Silas already awake, pulling on his boots in the gray light before dawn. He looked up when she appeared in his doorway, and whatever he saw in her face made him go absolutely still. "It is Nell," Vivian said. "She is burning up." Silas was on his feet and moving before she finished the sentence. Vivian followed him to Nell's room and watched as he gathered his daughter into his arms. The color drained from his face as he felt the fever radiating through her body. His hands were shaking. "How long?" he said. His voice was barely a whisper. "How long has she been like this?" "I do not know. I just found her." Silas carried Nell downstairs and laid her on the sofa. His movements were careful, but his eyes were wild. Vivian had seen fear before, the ordinary fear of uncertainty or hardship, but this was different. This was the fear of a man who had already lived through his worst nightmare and recognized it happening again. "Papa is here," he said, smoothing Nell's hair back from her burning face. "I am here, baby. You are going to be fine." But his voice cracked on the last word, and his hands would not stop trembling. And Vivian understood in that moment exactly what he was remembering. Ruth, the fever that came fast, the wife who did not survive. "I will get cool water," Vivian said, already moving toward the kitchen. "We need to bring the fever down." She worked quickly. Basin filled from the pump, clean cloths from the linen cupboard. Her hands were steady, even though her mind was racing. She had seen fever before, had nursed her aunt through influenza 2 winters ago, had sat through long nights in the boarding house with sick guests changing compresses, spooning broth, watching and waiting. But Nell was so small, and the terror in Silas's face told her this was more than just a summer cold. She returned to the front room and began wringing out cloths, laying them across Nell's forehead, pressing cool compresses to her neck and wrists, anywhere the blood ran close to the surface. "Should I ride for the doctor?" Silas asked. His voice was tight, controlled the voice of a man holding himself together through sheer force of will. "Where is the nearest one, Steep Creek? Maybe an hour each way if I ride hard." Vivian looked at Nell. The child's breathing had gone shallow and rapid, her small chest rising and falling too fast. 2 hours minimum. Every minute mattered. "Go," Vivian said. "I will stay with her." Silas hesitated. She could see the war in him, the desperate need to act, pulling against the terror of leaving his daughter. "I will not let anything happen to her," Vivian said quietly. She held his gaze and did not waver. "I promise." It was the same promise she had made to Nell 3 weeks ago in the kitchen, and it felt just as fragile, just as enormous. But Silas nodded. He squeezed Nell's hand one last time, pressed his lips to her burning forehead, and ran for the door. Vivian heard the barn door crash open, heard the urgent rhythm of hoofbeats that built and then faded into the distance until there was nothing left but silence and the shallow, ragged breathing of a very sick child. She worked steadily through the next hour, changed the compresses every few minutes as they grew warm against Nell's skin, coaxed drops of water between cracked lips, talked in a low, constant voice, even though the child seemed beyond hearing, because the sound of a voice was something to hold on to, something that said, "You are not alone." The fever climbed higher. Nell began to thrash, crying out for her mother in a thin, desperate voice that split Vivian's heart clean down the middle. "Mama. Want Mama. Where is Mama?" Vivian gathered the little girl against her chest and held her close. She could feel the heat pouring off Nell's body like a coal pressed against her skin. She could feel the rapid flutter of the child's heart against her own. So fast. Too fast. "Shh, sweetheart. I am here. You are safe. I have got you." Nell's eyes rolled back, showing only whites, and Vivian felt a terror so pure and absolute it nearly stopped her breath. But she did not let go. She held on tighter, pressing cool cloths against the child's face and neck, murmuring reassurances she was not sure she believed, counting the minutes by the rhythm of her own heartbeat. "Please," she thought, "please do not take her. Not this child. Not this man's last link to everything he has already lost." The sun climbed higher. Silas did not return. The front door slammed open so hard it hit the wall. Vivian's head snapped up as Silas burst into the room, his face gray with dust and fear. The doctor close behind a short, balding man with wire spectacles and a worn leather bag. "How is she?" Silas demanded, already at the sofa, already reaching for his daughter. "The fever is still climbing," Vivian said. She moved aside to let the doctor work. The doctor examined Nell with practiced efficiency. Pulse, temperature, breathing, pupils. When he straightened, his expression was grave. Summer fever. I have seen 3 cases this week. Comes on fast, burns hot. Can you help her? Silas's voice cracked. The doctor pulled a small brown bottle from his bag and measured a dose. This will help, but she needs constant care. Cool compresses, fluids, someone with her at all times. The fever has to break on its own. All we can do is help her body fight. He paused at the door on his way out. She is strong, young. That is in her favor. But the next 24 hours are critical. I will not lie to you, Renfield. Watch for the fever to spike. If it goes higher, cool bath. Not cold. Cool. You understand? Vivian nodded. I understand. The doctor left. The door closed. The house was suddenly very quiet and very small. Silas sank into the chair beside the sofa and buried his face in his hands. His shoulders shook. Once, violently, then went still. Vivian stood frozen, the basin of water still in her hands. She did not know what to say. She was not sure there was anything to say. I cannot lose her. Silas's voice came muffled through his hands, raw and broken in a way she had never heard from him before. I cannot. I already lost. He could not finish the sentence. The words simply stopped, cut off by a grief so deep it swallowed language. This was his wall coming down. Not slowly, not in pieces, but all at once, like a dam giving way under pressure it was never meant to hold. And Vivian understood that she was seeing something Silas Renfield had not shown another living soul since the day they put Ruth in the ground. She set the basin down and crossed to him and knelt beside his chair. She did not touch him. She simply knelt there close enough that he could feel her presence and spoke in the steadiest voice she could find. You will not lose her. We will not let that happen. Silas looked up. His eyes were red and desperate and stripped of every defense he had ever built. You cannot promise that. No, Vivian agreed quietly. But I can promise I will fight like hell to keep her here. Something shifted in his face. He reached out and gripped her hand, and his calloused fingers were tight around hers, holding on like she was the only solid thing left in a world that was tilting sideways. Thank you, he whispered. Vivian squeezed back. Go clean up. Get some coffee. I will stay with her. She turned back to Nell and wrung out a fresh cloth and laid it gently across the child's burning forehead. You listen to me, Nell Renfield, she said softly. You are not going anywhere. Your papa needs you, and I need you too. So you fight. You hear me? You fight. The night came and the fever did not break. Vivian kept vigil in the lamplight, changing compresses, trickling water between Nell's cracked lips, talking and singing and praying in a low, steady stream that blurred together until she could not tell which was which. Silas fell asleep in the chair beside the sofa, exhaustion finally claiming him, his head tipped back against the wall, one hand still resting on his daughter's shoulder. Vivian did not wake him. There was nothing he could do that she was not already doing, and he needed rest for whatever came next. Sometime in the deepest part of the night, Nell began to convulse. Her small body went rigid. Her back arched. Her limbs jerked uncontrollably. Vivian lunged forward, her heart stopping. Silas. Wake up. Silas. He was on his feet instantly. When he saw Nell, the color left his face completely. Together, they worked to hold her, to cool her, to bring the fever down before it consumed her. It felt like fighting a wildfire with cupped hands. hopeless, impossible, but they did not stop. And slowly, so slowly, the convulsions eased. Nell went limp. Her breathing was ragged but steady. Vivian pressed 2 fingers to the child's throat and felt the rapid flutter of her pulse. Still there, still fighting. "She is still with us," Vivian whispered. "She is still here." Silas made a sound that was half sob and half laugh. He gathered Nell against his chest and held her like he could anchor her to the world by sheer force of love. Tears streamed down his face, unchecked and unashamed. Dawn came slowly. Pale light bled through the windows, and beneath Vivian's hand, Nell's skin began to cool. Not much, but enough. Enough to mean the tide was turning. Vivian pressed her palm to the child's forehead, then pressed it again, not daring to trust what she was feeling. "Silas, check her. Tell me I am not imagining it." Silas laid his hand against Nell's cheek. His eyes went wide. "She is cooler. She is. Oh God, she is cooler." They stared at each other, afraid to believe, afraid to hope. And then Nell stirred in her father's arms and opened her eyes, really opened them clear and focused for the first time in 24 hours. "Papa," she said, her voice thin and confused. "Why are you crying?" Silas let out a choked laugh and pulled her close, burying his face in her hair. "Because I am happy, baby. Because you are okay." Vivian had to turn away. She pressed her hand to her mouth and let the sob come silent, and shaking the release of a fear so enormous she had not let herself feel it until it was over. When she trusted herself to turn back, Nell was looking at her with tired, wondering eyes. "You stayed with me?" the little girl asked. "The whole time," Silas answered quietly. "She did not leave you for a second." Nell reached out one small hand toward Vivian. Her fingers were pale and thin against the blanket. Vivian took them and held them gently, and felt the child's grip tighten with a strength that seemed impossible for someone so small and so recently close to death. "You promised you would not go away," Nell said. And there it was, the whisper from the beginning, the voice in the dark. The 3 words that started everything, and the promise that held it all together. "I keep my promises," Vivian said softly. Nell smiled, a tiny, exhausted smile that lit up her whole face. Then her eyes drifted closed, but this time it was sleep. Real sleep. Healing sleep. Silas looked up at Vivian, and the expression on his face made her breath catch. Gratitude and relief and something else. Something deeper. Something he shuddered away almost as quickly as it appeared, turning his face toward the window where morning light was flooding through the glass. "Thank you," he said. "I could not have done this without you." "Yes, you could have," Vivian said. But she did not let go of Nell's hand. They stayed like that as the sun rose higher and warmth poured through the windows, and the world outside went on turning as if it had not just come within a breath of shattering completely. Silas fell asleep, sitting upright, his hand on his daughter's shoulder. Vivian settled into the chair across from them, too exhausted to move, too wired to sleep. She watched them in the early morning light. This man and his child who had taken her in when she had nothing, who had given her a place to be useful, to matter. And she realized with a clarity that was almost painful that she did not want to leave. Not yet. Maybe not ever. The thought should have terrified her. Instead, it felt like the first true thing she had known in years. Nell recovered slowly over the days that followed her strength, returning in small increments like color seeping back into a photograph left too long in the sun. A few more minutes awake each day, a little more brightness in her eyes, the return of her appetite, first for broth and soft bread, then for the biscuits Vivian made each morning, then for everything. Vivian stayed close. She read to the little girl from the small collection of books Silas kept on a shelf in the front room, adventures and fairy tales, and a battered volume of poetry that had Ruth's name written on the inside cover in a careful feminine hand. Vivian paused when she saw the name, but did not put the book down. She read from it anyway, and Nell lay against the pillows, listening with heavy-lidded contentment, while Vivian's voice carried words that another woman had once loved. But something had changed in the house. Not with Nell, with Silas. He had grown quieter since the fever broke. Not the quiet of a man at peace, but the quiet of a man in retreat. He worked longer hours than before leaving while the sky was still dark and coming home after the sun had gone. When he did come inside, he moved through the rooms like a man trying not to disturb the air, polite, careful, distant in a way that felt deliberate. He no longer lingered in the kitchen doorway watching Vivian cook. He no longer sat on the porch in the evenings while she washed dishes. The easy rhythm they had been building, the shared silences that were beginning to feel comfortable, all of it evaporated like creek water in the July heat. Vivian told herself it was the aftermath of fear, that nearly losing Nell had shaken something loose in Silas, and he needed time to put himself back together. She told herself that his distance had nothing to do with her, that the moment in the lamplight when he gripped her hand and let his walls come crashing down was simply crisis. Simply survival. Not something that meant what she had for one unguarded moment allowed herself to think it might mean. But doubt is a persistent thing. It crept into the long evenings when she sat alone in the kitchen, listening to the house settle around her. It whispered in the spaces between their careful conversations. It told her what she had always been told. You are temporary. You are useful, but not necessary. Sooner or later, the door will close, and you will be standing on the other side of it, wondering what you did wrong. On the 5th morning after the fever broke, Vivian was stripping the sheets from Silas's bed to wash them. She pulled open the drawer of the nightstand to check for stray handkerchiefs, and her hand closed around something soft. She drew it out and unfolded it and felt the air leave her lungs. A handkerchief. White cotton, yellowed slightly with age, edged with delicate hand stitching. In one corner, embroidered in thread that had once been lavender but had faded to the palest purple, were 3 letters. R.E.W. Ruth Ellen Renfield. Vivian held it to her face without thinking and caught the faintest ghost of perfume. Something floral, something that had once been a living woman's scent pressed into fabric by warmth and proximity and daily use. Something that Silas had kept in his nightstand drawer for 4 years, close enough to reach in the dark. She folded the handkerchief carefully and placed it back exactly where she had found it, and closed the drawer and stood there in the empty bedroom with her hands at her sides and understood something she had been trying not to understand. That evening, she cooked supper in silence. She set the table for 3 and ladled stew into bowls and cut bread and poured milk for Nell and coffee for Silas, and did everything she was supposed to do with a precision that felt mechanical. When Silas came in, he glanced at her and then glanced again as though he sensed something off, but could not identify it. "Everything all right?" he asked. "Fine," Vivian said. "Just tired." It was the first lie she had told him. It sat between them like a stone dropped into water, sending ripples neither of them acknowledged. Nell chattered through the meal, oblivious, telling a long and winding story about a rabbit she had seen near the creek that morning. And Vivian nodded and smiled and said the right things at the right moments, and wondered how long she could keep doing this before something inside her broke. After supper, after the dishes, after Nell was in bed, Vivian sat in her room with the door closed and the brass bolt turned and stared at her carpet bag sitting in the corner. She had not unpacked it fully. Not all the way. Some part of her, some deep and instinctive part that had learned early and hard that nothing was permanent, had kept a few things inside. Her mother's thimble. A small photograph of her parents, taken before Vivian was born, the edges worn soft from handling. A spare pair of stockings. The necessities of a woman who was always ready to leave. She had told Nell she would not go. She had promised. And sitting here in this borrowed room, in this borrowed life, she understood for the first time the terrible weight of a promise made to a child who had already been broken by one that was not kept. She was living in a dead woman's house, sleeping down the hall from a man who still reached for his wife's handkerchief in the night, caring for a child who called out for her mama in her sleep. And no matter how many floors she scrubbed or meals she cooked or songs she hummed while hanging laundry, she could not fill the space that Ruth had left. She was not Ruth. She would never be Ruth. And the longer she stayed, the more it would hurt when Silas finally found a way to tell her it was time to go. That afternoon, Vivian walked to the Mercantile in Steep Creek. It took her nearly 2 hours on foot in the heat, but she needed to move, needed to think, needed to do something other than wait for a verdict she was certain was coming. She asked the clerk if there was work available in town. Anything. Cleaning, cooking, laundry. The clerk, a thin woman with sympathetic eyes, said she would ask around. Vivian wrote her name on a slip of paper and left it on the counter and walked the 2 hours back to the ranch, feeling hollow and practical and completely in control of a decision she did not want to make. She did not tell Silas. The distance between them continued to grow. Meals became exercises in politeness. Pass the salt. Thank you. More coffee. No thank you. I will be late tonight. All right. Good night. Good night. The words were correct and courteous and completely empty, like furniture arranged in a room no one lived in. Nell mercifully seemed unaware of the tension. Her recovery was complete, now her energy returning in full force, and she chattered through meals about birds and butterflies and the shapes she saw in clouds. She had begun following Vivian again with the same quiet devotion as before the fever, but now there was something different in it. Not just observation, attachment, trust. The particular fierceness of a child who has learned what almost losing someone feels like. Then Mrs. Garvey came. The sound of a wagon approaching on a Tuesday afternoon made Vivian look up from the garden where she was pulling weeds. A well-kept buggy, pulled by a matched pair of grays, driven by a woman in a dark blue dress and an elaborate hat that seemed designed to communicate authority at 50 paces. The woman climbed down with practiced grace and surveyed the ranch with an expression that managed to be simultaneously curious and disapproving. She was perhaps 40 handsome rather than pretty, with sharp features and shrewd dark eyes that catalogued everything they touched. Vivian set down her trowel and walked toward the house, arriving at the front porch just as Silas emerged from the barn. He stopped short when he saw the visitor. His jaw tightened. Mrs. Garvey. Mr. Renfield. The woman's voice was crisp and cultured, with an edge like a freshly stropped razor. "I heard your daughter was ill. I came to see how she is faring. She is better. Thank you for your concern. I am glad to hear it." Mrs. Garvey's gaze shifted to Vivian. It traveled from her bare head to her simple dress to the dirt beneath her fingernails with the efficiency of an auctioneer appraising livestock. And who might this be? Vivian felt herself being weighed and measured in a single glance. She lifted her chin slightly. She had been looked at like this before. By her aunt, by the women at the boarding house, by Orrin Sutley on the platform. She knew what it meant. It meant someone was deciding her worth based on what they could see, and what they could see was never enough. "This is Miss Lockhart," Silas said. "She has been helping with the house and looking after Nell." "I see." Mrs. Garvey's tone suggested she saw considerably more than that. "How fortunate for you to have found such assistance. Though I must say, Mr. Renfield, when I heard you had a young woman living under your roof, I was quite surprised." The implication hung in the air. Vivian's face burned, but before she could speak, Silas stepped forward. "Miss Lockhart saved my daughter's life. She stayed up for 2 days straight, nursing Nell through summer fever when I was half out of my mind with worry. I will not have her disrespected in her own home." Mrs. Garvey's eyebrows rose. Her own home. "My dear Mr. Renfield, surely you see how this appears. A young, unmarried woman living alone with a widower. People talk, and what they are saying is not kind. I do not give a damn what people are saying. Perhaps you should. For your daughter's sake, if not your own. A child needs stability, propriety, a proper mother figure. Nell has what she needs. Does she, Mrs.?" Garvey looked at Vivian again, and this time there was something almost like pity in her expression. "No offense intended, Miss Lockhart, but you are barely more than a child yourself, without references, without family, showing up out of nowhere. It raises questions." Vivian found her voice. "I understand your concern, Mrs. Garvey. My presence here is purely practical. Mr. Renfield needed help, and I needed work. That is all." "Is it?" The older woman's expression softened slightly. "My dear, I have lived in this territory for 20 years. I have seen arrangements like this before, and they rarely end well. For the woman especially." There was something almost kind in her tone now. A warning offered woman to woman across the divide of age and experience. Vivian felt her certainty waver. She had been so focused on Nell on being useful on the small, fragile thing growing between herself and Silas that she had not stopped to consider how it must look from the outside. Mr. Renfield, Mrs. Garvey continued, turning back to Silas. "This situation cannot continue as it is. The talk in town is already pointed. Unless, of course, you intend to make the arrangement permanent." The question dropped like a stone into still water. "I think you should leave now," Mrs. Garvey, Silas said quietly. The woman drew herself up. "I came out of Christian charity to warn you that you are making a mistake that will damage your daughter's reputation and future. If you choose to ignore that warning, the consequences are on your own head." She drove away without looking back. The dust from her wheels hung in the air long after she disappeared. Vivian stood on the porch, her hands clenched at her sides. Shame and anger warred in her chest. She had known on some level that her presence was irregular, but hearing it stated so bluntly, hearing herself described as a threat to Nell's well-being was something else entirely. "Do not listen to her," Silas said. She is a busybody who thinks she runs this town. She is not wrong, though. Vivian forced herself to meet his eyes. People are talking. And if it hurts Nell, if it makes things harder for her, then maybe I should. Are you saying you want to leave? The question stopped her cold. She looked at him and saw something she had not expected to see in his face. Not anger, not relief. Fear. I do not know, she said honestly. I do not want to. But I do not want to cause problems for you either. The silence between them stretched taut as wire. Silas looked at the horizon. When he spoke, his voice was low and rough. You are not causing problems. You are. These past weeks since you have been here, it has been different. Better. The house feels less empty. Nell is happy. And I... He stopped, shook his head, could not finish. Then late that afternoon, Nell pulled Vivian into the kitchen with both hands, her face bright with purpose. Can we make cookies? Mama used to make cookies with me, the kind with cinnamon. Vivian's hand stilled on the counter. I do not know your mama's recipe, sweetheart. That is okay. We can make them different. They spent the rest of the afternoon together at the table. Flour and sugar and butter measured carefully. Dough rolled out on the worn wooden surface. Nell stood on a chair to reach her small hands, copying Vivian's movements with intense concentration. Flour dusted her nose, and her tongue poked out slightly as she worked, and she was so completely absorbed in the task that she looked for those few minutes like nothing bad had ever happened to her. You are very good at this, Vivian said. Mama said I had baker's hands. Nell held up her palms and studied them seriously. I do not remember if that is true, though. I do not remember very much about her. That must be hard. Papa says she loved me very much. He says she used to sing to me at bedtime. Nell looked up with those clear blue eyes. Do you think she would be mad that I like it when you sing to me instead? Vivian set down the rolling pin. She knelt beside Nell's chair and brought them eye to eye. Your mama loved you more than anything, and I think she would be happy that you have someone to take care of you, that you are not alone, but you are not my real mama. Nell said it matter-of-factly. Mrs. Garvey said so. I heard her talking to Papa. Anger flared white-hot in Vivian's chest. She breathed through it. No, I am not your real mama. But that does not mean I do not care about you. It does not mean I do not want to be here. Do you love me simple, direct, without calculation or guile? The way only a child can ask the most enormous question in the world, as though it were no bigger than asking for a glass of water. Yes, Vivian said quietly. I do love you. Nell threw her arms around Vivian's neck and buried her flour-dusted face against her shoulder. I love you too. I am glad you are here. Vivian held her tightly and blinked back tears and felt the last wall inside her chest give way completely. That evening, Silas came in to find them at the table, cookies between them, the kitchen warm with cinnamon. Nell told him everything. About the baking, about the flour, about what Vivian had said. And then she added, Vivian said, Mama would be happy, I am not alone. Do you think that is true? Silas's eyes found Vivian's across the room. Yes, he said quietly, I think that is true. After Nell was asleep, Vivian sat on the porch, watching the stars. She heard the door open behind her and Silas's footsteps crossing the worn boards. He sat beside her without asking, leaving a careful distance between them. They were quiet for a long time. I have been thinking about what Mrs. Garvey said, Silas began. She is right about one thing. This is not sustainable." He paused, "But not for the reasons she thinks." "What do you mean, that I cannot keep pretending this is just a practical arrangement, that you are just someone helping out temporarily, because it is not true. Not anymore." His voice was rough, each word pulled out of him like something deeply rooted. "I know you did not come here looking for this. I offered you shelter because it was the right thing to do, but somewhere along the way it became more than that. For me, at least." He told her about the distance, about why he had pulled away after the fever. Not because he wanted her gone, but because he was terrified of wanting her to stay. Because wanting someone meant the possibility of losing them, and he had already survived that once, and was not certain he could survive it again. "You saved my daughter," he said. "You made this house feel like a home. You." He broke off and tried again. "I think I am falling in love with you." The stars blurred. Vivian pressed her hands together in her lap and felt them shaking. "You do not have to say that," she whispered. "I am not saying it because I have to. I am saying it because it is true." He reached out and took her hand. "I am asking you to marry me, not because of Mrs. Garvey, not to save appearances, because I want you here, because Nell needs you. Because I need you." Vivian looked at their joined hands, at his thumb tracing small circles over her knuckles, and she told him the truth she had been hiding. "I am scared," she said. "I have spent my whole life trying to be enough for people who did not want me. My aunt took me in out of duty. Orrin promised me a future, and then took one look at me and walked away. I do not know how to believe that someone would actually choose me, that someone would look at me and decide I was worth keeping." Silas was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I am not those people, Vivian, and you are not the girl on that platform anymore. You are the woman who held my daughter through the worst night of her life and refused to let go. You are already everything we need. You just do not know it yet." "Yes," she said. "Yes, I will marry you." They told Nell the next morning. The little girl's face split into the widest smile Vivian had ever seen. "Really? You are going to be my mama?" "If that is all right with you." Nell's expression shifted to something fierce and serious. "You will not leave, even when I am bad, even when I get sick again. Never. I promise." Nell was quiet for a moment, processing. Then she looked up at Vivian with those blue eyes full of a hope so raw it made Vivian's chest ache. "Can I call you Mama?" Vivian could not speak. She nodded, and Nell stepped closer and took her hand, and whispered the words that had been waiting since the very beginning, since before the dust and the sun and the silence, since before any of it. "Be my mama." Vivian knelt down and pulled the little girl into her arms and held her, and the tears came freely now, and she did not try to stop them. "Yes, sweetheart. Yes, I will be your mama." And Nell held on with the fierce, desperate strength of a child who had learned too early what it meant to lose someone, and was determined never to let it happen again. And Vivian held on with the strength of a woman who had finally found the thing she had been searching for her entire life without knowing its name. Over Nell's shoulder, through her tears, Vivian saw Silas standing in the kitchen doorway. His eyes were bright. His hand rested on the door frame. And on his face was an expression she would remember for the rest of her life. Not just love, though it was that. Not just gratitude, though it was that too. It was the look of a man watching his house become a home again, watching the empty places fill, watching something he thought had died with Ruth come back to life in a form he never expected. He did not say a word. He did not need to. Everything that mattered was already in the room. The wedding was on a Sunday morning in early August, 6 weeks to the day since Vivian had stepped off the train into the blinding Montana sun with nothing but a carpet bag and a broken promise. The church was the same white building at the edge of Steep Creek where the steeple rose like a needle against the sky. Pastor Calloway was waiting on the steps, a kind-faced man in his 50s with silver hair and eyes that had seen enough of the territory's joy and sorrow to recognize both without judgment. He smiled when he saw them coming up the road in the wagon, Silas in his best clothes, dark trousers and a clean white shirt, and a vest that looked like it had been brushed and pressed with more care than it had received in years. Vivian beside him, in the gray cotton dress she had sewn herself by lamplight after Nell went to bed each night, and between them, Nell in pale blue with white ribbons Vivian had stitched on the evening before, practically vibrating with a happiness too large for her small body to contain. The church was empty. Just the four of them and the dust motes drifting in the shafts of light from the windows. Vivian had imagined her wedding 100 times as a girl. A full church, music, flowers, celebration. This was nothing like those dreams, but as she stood before the simple wooden altar with Silas's hand warm and steady around hers, and Nell pressed against her side, clutching a fistful of wildflowers she had picked that morning, Vivian discovered that the dreams did not matter. This was real. This was hers. The ceremony was brief. Pastor Calloway spoke of commitment and partnership, of building a life on faith and honest work and the kind of love that shows itself not in grand gestures, but in the daily choice to stay. He asked Silas if he would take this woman as his wife. "I will," Silas said. His voice did not waver. "And do you, Vivian Lockhart, take this man as your husband to stand beside him in good times and in hard?" Vivian looked at Silas, at the quiet strength in his face, at the gentleness in his pale eyes. She thought about the leap this was, the risk, and she thought about the alternative, walking away, being alone again, never knowing what they might have built. "I will," she said clearly. Nell made a small, happy sound. Pastor Calloway smiled. "By the authority vested in me by the territory of Montana, I now pronounce you husband and wife." The kiss was brief and chaste, little more than a brush of lips, but it sent warmth spreading through Vivian's chest like the first heat of a fire catching in dry wood. When they pulled apart, Nell was grinning so wide it seemed her face could not contain it. "You are married now. You are really married." They signed the certificate. Vivian watched the pen form her new name on the paper. Vivian Renfield. She stared at it. 2 words that meant she belonged somewhere, that she was no longer a woman passing through. She had a name that connected her to other people, to this man, to this child, to this piece of land at the edge of the world. They stepped out of the church into the bright sunlight, and Vivian was blinking against the glare when a voice called from across the street, "Mr. Renfield, Mrs. Renfield, please wait." Vivian's stomach dropped. Mrs. Garvey was hurrying toward them, her face flushed, her hat slightly askew. But when she reached the wagon, her expression was not what Vivian expected. Not judgment, not condemnation, something closer to contrition. "I heard you were getting married today," Mrs. Garvey said, slightly breathless. "I wanted to say that I owe you an apology, Mrs. Renfield. I was wrong to speak to you the way I did. I thought I was protecting this community, protecting your daughter, but I was merely being judgmental and unkind. You clearly care for this family, and they clearly care for you." "Thank you," Vivian managed. "That is kind of you." "It is nothing more than you deserve." Mrs. Garvey glanced at Silas. "You have a good woman, Mr. Renfield. I hope you know that." "I do," Silas said quietly. Mrs. Garvey nodded once and walked away, and Vivian stared after her in bewilderment until Silas said, "Well, that was unexpected." And then they were laughing, all three of them, sitting in the wagon in the middle of Steep Creek's main street, laughing like fools, and the sound of it carried across the dusty road and up into the wide blue sky. The days that followed were tender and uncertain in the way of all new beginnings. Vivian and Silas moved around each other with the careful courtesy of two people learning the shape of a shared life. There were moments of awkwardness, mornings when they reached for the same cup and their hands touched and neither knew whether to hold on or pull away. Evenings when silence settled between them and Vivian could not tell if it was comfortable or merely cautious. Their first night as husband and wife, Silas had stood in the doorway of his bedroom, their bedroom now, and told her quietly that he expected nothing, that she could keep her old room if she preferred, that he would wait as long as she needed. Vivian had looked at him, this man who had shown her more kindness in 6 weeks than she had received in 18 years, and crossed the room and taken his hand and said, "We are partners now. We figure things out together." They lay side by side that first night, not touching both, staring at the ceiling, both painfully aware of the other's breathing. Somewhere around midnight, Vivian's hand found his in the dark. His fingers closed around hers, and neither of them let go. And that small point of contact, palm against calloused palm in the silence of a house that was learning to breathe again, felt more intimate than anything she had ever experienced. In the morning, she woke to find his arm across her waist. His face relaxed in sleep, and she lay very still for a long time, memorizing the feeling of being held by someone who had chosen to hold her. But there was sweetness, too. Silas's hand at the small of her back as he passed behind her in the kitchen. The way he said her name now softer than before, as though the word itself had changed meaning. The way he looked at her sometimes when he thought she was not watching, with an expression so unguarded it made her heart stutter. One evening in the second week of their marriage, Vivian was putting away laundry in their bedroom when she opened the nightstand drawer and saw Ruth's handkerchief. She had known it was there, had found it weeks ago, and put it back and said nothing. But now she was not a guest in this house. She was his wife. And she understood that what she did in this moment would set the course for everything that followed. She picked up the handkerchief and carried it downstairs to where Silas sat on the porch, his boots off his stockinged feet on the rail, watching the last light drain from the sky. She held it out to him. Silas looked at the handkerchief and then at her, and something moved behind his eyes. A flicker of the old pain, the old guard going up. "You do not have to hide her from me," Vivian said quietly. "She is part of your life. She is part of Nell. And that means she is part of mine too." Silas took the handkerchief. He held it for a long moment, running his thumb over the faded embroidered initials. R.E.W. Then he stood and walked inside, and Vivian heard him moving through the front room. When she followed, she found him placing the handkerchief on the shelf beside the fireplace, not hidden in a drawer, not tucked away in private darkness, out in the open where it could be seen. "Thank you," he said, without turning around, "for understanding." Vivian crossed to him and put her hand on his arm. Ruth is not someone I want to erase. She gave you Nell. She built this home. I am not here to replace her. I am here to add to what she started." Silas covered her hand with his. When he turned to face her, his eyes were bright but steady. "I know," he said. "And I think she would have liked you." It was the closest he had come to giving Vivian his whole heart, not yet complete, but open, and opening further. Then the trouble came. Marshall Haddon rode out to the ranch on a Thursday afternoon, his badge catching the sunlight, his expression grim. Silas met him in the yard. Vivian watched from the kitchen window, a dishcloth still in her hands, as the two men spoke in low, tense voices. When the marshal left, Silas came inside, and Vivian could see the tension in his shoulders, in the set of his jaw, in the way he poured his coffee without looking at her. What was that about ranch business? It did not sound like ranch business. He said fences cut, cattle missing. Silas set down his cup. "I will handle it." "Handle what?" exactly. Vivian put down the dishcloth. "Silas, we are married now. Your problems are my problems. That is how this works. Not this." His voice was harder than she had heard it since the night of Nell's fever. "I will not have you scared in your own home. I will not have Nell frightened. I can handle this. By yourself." The marshal said 3 ranches have been hit. He said you need help. The marshal does not know this land the way I do. Vivian stared at him and saw it clearly for the first time. Not stubbornness, not pride, fear. The same fear that had made him pull away after the fever. The bone-deep terror of a man who has already lost everything once, and who believes that the only way to prevent it from happening again is to stand between the people he loves and every possible danger alone, always alone, because needing help means admitting vulnerability, and admitting vulnerability means acknowledging that you cannot control what happens next. "We are partners," she said firmly. "You told me that. You promised me that. Partners do not shut each other out." Silas's jaw worked. He looked at her for a long moment, and she held his gaze without flinching. "I will not lose you," he said roughly. "I already lost Ruth. I will not go through that again. Not with you. Not with Nell." "Then stop trying to carry everything alone." "Because shutting me out is not protection, Silas. It is just another kind of loneliness." He did not answer. He took his coffee and went to the barn, and Vivian stood in the kitchen alone, angry and afraid and certain of only one thing. Whatever was coming, she would not let him face it by himself, whether he wanted her help or not. That night, she lay awake beside him, listening to his breathing, feeling the tension that radiated from his body, even in sleep. He twitched once, his hand reaching across the mattress, finding her hip settling there. Even unconscious, even in the grip of whatever dark dream had him, he reached for her. And Vivian covered his hand with hers and thought about what it meant to love a man who believed he had to stand alone against the world, who had carried everything on his own shoulders for so long that sharing the weight felt like weakness rather than partnership. She thought about Ruth, about a woman she had never met who had died in this bed, or one very like it, leaving behind a husband who still kept her handkerchief close and a daughter who still cried for her in the dark. She thought about what Ruth would want. Not a man who shut himself inside a fortress of competence and fear. A man who let people in. A man who trusted. Vivian pressed her lips to Silas's shoulder in the dark. "I am not going anywhere," she whispered, "even when you try to push me away." He did not wake. But his hand tightened on her hip, and she chose to believe that somewhere beneath the sleep and the fear he heard her. The attack came 3 nights later. Vivian woke to the sound of horses. Too many horses moving too fast and too close to the house. The rhythm was wrong. Not the easy canter of a neighbor passing by or cattle shifting in the corral. This was hard riding, purposeful, the sound of men coming with intent. She sat up. Beside her, Silas was already awake, already pulling on his trousers in the dark, his movements quick and silent. He reached for the rifle beside the bed. "Stay here," he said quietly. "Lock the door behind me. Keep Nell safe. No matter what you hear, do not come outside. Silas, promise me." His eyes were fierce in the moonlight. Vivian's chest constricted, but she nodded. "I promise." He kissed her. Hard and quick, the kind of kiss that tasted like fear and love in equal measure. Then he was gone. Vivian threw off the covers and ran to Nell's room. The child was still asleep, curled on her side, her rag doll clutched against her chest. Vivian closed the door and wedged a chair under the handle and stood there in the dark, listening. The first gunshot split the night. Vivian flinched. Her whole body went cold. Through the window she could see shapes moving near the barn. 4 riders, maybe 5, circling in the moonlight. Silas was behind the water trough, the rifle braced against his shoulder. She saw the flash when he fired and heard a man shout, and one of the horses wheeled away. But there were too many. They were spreading out, flanking him, and Silas could not watch every direction at once. A second shot. Closer. Glass shattered somewhere downstairs. And then one of the riders broke away from the group and turned his horse toward the house. Vivian's blood turned to ice. She looked at Nell's door with the chair wedged under the handle. She looked at the window where the rider was approaching, his silhouette growing larger against the moonlit sky. She thought about the promise she had made. Stay inside. Keep Nell safe. But if that rider reached the house, if he got inside, if he found Nell. Vivian made her decision in less than a heartbeat. She ran to the bedroom and pulled the spare pistol from the drawer where she had seen Silas keep it. The metal was cold and heavy in her hand. She checked the chamber the way she had watched Silas do it once. Loaded. She had never fired a gun in her life. She went downstairs. She slipped out the back door. She circled around the side of the house, keeping low, keeping to the shadows. The rider had dismounted and was approaching the front porch. Young, maybe 20. Wild eyes and a scraggly beard. He had a pistol in his hand. Vivian stepped out of the darkness and raised the gun. "Stop right there." The man spun. He looked at her, at the pistol shaking in her hands, and he laughed. "Well now, Renfield's got himself a woman with teeth. Why do you not put that down before you hurt yourself, sweetheart?" He took a step toward her. Vivian pulled the trigger. The recoil slammed through her arms, and the shot went wide, hitting the dirt 2 feet to his left. But the sound was enormous in the night, and the rider stumbled backward, his eyes going wide with shock. "She is crazy," he shouted to the others. "The woman is shooting at us." From behind the water trough, Silas's voice rang out. "Vivian, get back inside." But the damage was done. The riders were circling, uncertain. They had expected one man alone, an easy target. They had not expected fire from 2 directions. "We should go. This is not worth it. Forget the cattle. Let us ride." They wheeled their horses and thundered into the darkness, and the sound of their hoofbeats faded and faded until there was nothing left but silence, and the ringing in Vivian's ears, and the shaking in her hands that she could not make stop. Silas appeared beside her. He took the pistol from her trembling fingers and set it on the porch rail, and then he pulled her against his chest and held her so tightly she could feel his heartbeat hammering against her cheek. "What were you thinking? You promised you would stay inside. You promised." "I know." Vivian's voice broke. "I am sorry, but there were too many of them, and one was coming for the house. For Nell. I could not just stand there and let him." Her words dissolved. The fear and the adrenaline crashed over her at once, and she was crying, really crying, shaking against him while he held her and rocked her slightly and said things she could not quite make out. But that sounded like, "Thank you," and "I am sorry," and "Do not ever do that again," all tangled together. When she finally pulled back, his face was wet too. "Mama, Papa," they turned. Nell stood in the doorway, her doll in one hand, her face pale and frightened in the moonlight. Vivian crossed to her, immediately dropping to her knees, pulling the child close. "It is all right, sweetheart. Some trouble with the animals. But everything is fine now. The bad men are gone." Nell looked at her with eyes that were too old for her face. "Did you shoot them?" Vivian hesitated. "I tried to protect our home. Sometimes being brave means standing up to scary things. But you do not have to worry about that. That is what mamas are for." Nell buried her face against Vivian's shoulder. "I am glad you are my mama." Vivian held her and breathed in the sweet smell of her hair and felt the fierce, rapid beating of the child's heart against her own, and thought that she would have fired that gun 1,000 times, that she would have faced 100 men on horseback, that there was nothing in this world she would not do to keep this child safe. Later, after Nell had been carried back to bed and soothed back to sleep, Silas sat on the porch steps with his elbows on his knees and his head bowed. Vivian sat beside him. The night was quiet now, impossibly quiet. The stars blazed overhead like they were trying to make up for everything the darkness had held. Silas did not speak for a long time. When he did, his voice was raw and stripped of every defense. "When I heard you go outside, when I heard that shot," he stopped, swallowed, started again. "I thought I was losing you. The way I lost Ruth. I thought God was taking everything from me again. And I could not breathe, Vivian. I could not breathe." His shoulders began to shake. Not the single violent tremor of the night Nell was sick. This was deeper. This was a man letting go of something he had carried for 4 years alone. The grief of burying his wife. The terror of almost burying his daughter. The suffocating weight of believing that he had to hold the world together with his own 2 hands because the moment he let go, it would all fall apart. Vivian did not try to stop it. She did not offer words or platitudes or reassurances. She simply sat beside him and put her hand on his back and let him break. Let the sobs come ragged and ugly and real. Let him be a man in pain instead of a man in control. When it finally passed, when his breathing slowed and his shoulders stilled, he lifted his head and looked at her with red, swollen eyes that held nothing back. "I love you," he said. "I should have said it before. I should have said it every day since you walked into this house and made it something worth living in again. I love you, Vivian, and I am sorry I tried to do this alone." Vivian took his face in her hands. His skin was rough with stubble and wet with tears, and warm beneath her palms. "I love you too," she said. I think I have loved you since you stepped forward on that platform and offered me shelter when no one else in the world would have bothered." She kissed him, not the careful, chaste kiss of their wedding. Something deeper, something that tasted of salt and exhaustion and the fierce, desperate gratitude of two people who have walked through fire and found each other still standing on the other side. They sat on the porch until the sky began to lighten in the east. They did not speak. They did not need to. Vivian leaned against his shoulder, and Silas kept his arm around her, and somewhere inside the house, their daughter slept peacefully, and the silence that surrounded them was not empty. It was full of everything they had survived and everything they would build, and the quiet, steady certainty that they would build it together. The autumn came slowly that year, as though the land itself needed time to recover from the brutality of summer. The grasses turned from brittle gold to a deeper amber. The cottonwood trees along the creek dropped their leaves in drifts of pale yellow that Nell collected in great armfuls and carried into the house like treasure. The sky shifted from its relentless summer blue to something softer, layered with thin clouds that caught the light at dawn and dusk and turned the horizon into something that looked painted by a hand too generous with color. The rustlers were caught 2 counties over, tried and sentenced before the first frost. Marshal Haddon rode out to the ranch to deliver the news personally. Silas shook his hand on the porch and thanked him, and the marshal tipped his hat to Vivian and said, "You have got steel in you, Mrs. Renfield. This territory could use more of that." Then he rode away, and Vivian stood in the yard watching the dust settle behind his horse and felt something she had not felt before. Not relief, exactly. Completion. The closing of a door she no longer needed open. Life on the ranch settled into a rhythm that felt both ordinary and miraculous. Vivian woke each morning beside Silas, still marveling at the simple fact of his warmth, the weight of his arm across her waist, the sound of his breathing in the dark before dawn. They worked the long days together, Silas with the horses and the cattle and the fences that always needed mending. Vivian in the house and the garden that had exploded with more vegetables than they could possibly eat now that it had someone tending it with real attention. She began preserving the harvest for winter. Tomatoes and beans and pickled cucumbers lined up in glass jars on the shelves of the root cellar, their colors glowing like jewels in the lamplight. Each jar was a small act of faith. Evidence that she believed she would still be here when the snow came, that this was not temporary, that she was building something meant to last. Nell started school in town, riding in with Silas twice a week and staying with a neighbor family on the days between. She came home bursting with stories about her classmates and her lessons, spreading her papers across the kitchen table to show Vivian the letters she had learned to form. Her handwriting was crooked and enthusiastic, and Vivian praised every wobbly letter as though it were calligraphy. She pinned Nell's best work to the wall beside the stove where she could see it while she cooked, and the little girl glowed with a pride so fierce it lit up the whole room. One afternoon, Nell came home quieter than usual. She sat at the table with her hands folded and her chin tucked and did not look up when Vivian set a plate of cookies in front of her. "What happened?" Vivian asked, sitting down across from her. Nell was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Emily Porter said, 'You are not my real mama.' She said, 'Real mamas are the ones who have you as a baby, and everyone else is just pretending.'" Vivian felt the words like a blade slipped between her ribs. She reached across the table and lifted Nell's chin so their eyes met. "Do you remember the night you were sick? When the fever was so high You could not stop shaking. Nell nodded. Do you remember who held you? Who stayed awake all night, putting cool cloths on your face and singing to you and telling you to fight? You did. That is what a real mama does, Vivian said quietly. A real mama is not about how you came into each other's lives. It is about what you do once you are there. It is about showing up and staying and choosing each other every single day. That is what makes it real. Nell's eyes filled with tears. She came around the table and climbed into Vivian's lap, too big for it, really, but neither of them cared. She pressed her face into Vivian's shoulder, and Vivian held her and rocked her gently, and thought that Emily Porter could say whatever she wanted. Nothing in the world could make this less real. When Silas came in from the barn that evening, he found them still at the table, Nell doing her letters while Vivian peeled potatoes. The kitchen was warm and golden with lamplight and the smell of stew. He paused in the doorway the way he always did, taking it in, and Nell looked up and said, Papa Vivian says being a real mama is about showing up and choosing each other every day. Is that true? Silas looked at Vivian. She saw his throat work. Yes, he said. That is exactly true. Silas changed too. Not dramatically, not in ways a stranger would notice. But Vivian noticed. She noticed that he came in from work earlier now that he lingered at the kitchen table after supper, that his hand would find the small of her back when he passed behind her, or rest briefly on her shoulder when he leaned over to see what Nell was drawing. She noticed that he laughed more, a low, quiet sound that seemed to surprise him every time it happened, as though he had forgotten his own voice was capable of making it. She noticed that he no longer slept with his back to the center of the bed, that he reached for her in the night without waking, pulling her close with an unconscious tenderness that made her chest ache. She noticed that Ruth's handkerchief remained on the shelf by the fireplace, visible and honored, and that Silas sometimes glanced at it as he passed, but no longer looked as though the sight of it might break him. The grief was still there. It would always be there. But it had shifted from something that filled every room to something that rested quietly in the corner, acknowledged and respected, no longer demanding to be the only thing that mattered. On an afternoon in late September, Vivian walked to the creek alone. She needed the air and the space and the sound of water moving over stones. She sat on the bank with her bare feet in the cool current and pressed her hands against her stomach and closed her eyes and let herself believe what her body had been telling her for weeks. She told Silas that night after Nell was asleep. They were sitting on the porch, their customary place, the place where every important truth between them had been spoken. The stars were thick overhead, and the air smelled of wood smoke and dying grass, and the particular sweetness of a season turning. Silas, she said, I need to tell you something. He turned to look at her. She could see his face in the lamplight from the window. The lines around his eyes, the way his expression shifted from relaxed to alert in an instant. Vivian took his hand and placed it against her stomach. She did not say anything else. She did not need to. Silas went very still. His hand remained where she had placed it. His fingers spread wide, as though he might feel through fabric and skin to the truth beneath. His lips parted. His eyes widened. A baby, he breathed. We are having a baby. Yes. Are you happy? He did not answer with words. He pulled her into his arms and held her with a ferocity that she felt in her bones. When he finally drew back, his cheeks were wet and his voice was shaking. I am terrified, he said. After Ruth, after what happened, I am terrified of losing you. of going through that again. Vivian took his face in her hands the way she had learned to do when she needed him to hear her. Not just listen, but hear. I am scared too, but we are going to face it together. I am strong, Silas. I survived summer fever with Nell. I survived rustlers. I survived being left on a train platform with nothing in the world but $17 and a broken promise. I can survive this. You are the strongest person I know, he whispered. Then do not let fear steal the joy. We are making a life, Silas. Not just a life together. A life. A new person. That is a miracle. He pressed his forehead to hers, and they stayed like that, breathing the same air, feeling the weight of what was coming settle around them like a blanket, heavy and warm and full of possibility. They told Nell the next morning. The little girl listened with her mouth open and her eyes enormous, and then she erupted. A baby! A real baby, like a brother or a sister. That is right, Vivian said. Can I help take care of it? Can I teach it things? Can I hold it? Of course you can, sweetheart. Nell threw her arms around Vivian's waist. I am going to be the best big sister in the whole entire world. She pulled back and looked up with sudden seriousness. You have to eat a lot now. I read that in a book. The mama has to eat so the baby can grow. Silas laughed. That rusty, wonderful, surprised sound. I think we can manage that. Winter came hard and fast that year. Snow buried the ranch in silence. The world contracted to the house, the barn, the path beaten between them. Vivian grew larger. Her body ached in ways she had not expected. There were days when fear gripped her so tightly she could not breathe. Days when the ghost of Ruth felt close and terrible. A reminder that not every story ended with a mother holding her child. But Silas was beside her through all of it. He rubbed her back when she was sick, brought her water in the middle of the night, held her when the fear became too much, and said nothing, because sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is simply stay. Nell helped in her own way. She brought Vivian wildflowers pressed between the pages of books. She read aloud in her halting, earnest voice, while Vivian rested on the sofa. She placed her small hand on Vivian's stomach and gasped with delight when the baby kicked. He is strong, Nell declared. Or she, Vivian said, smiling. Nell insisted with absolute certainty. I already decided. Silas built a cradle from salvaged oak, sanding it smooth over weeks until the wood felt like silk under Vivian's fingers. He painted it white and set it beside their bed, and sometimes Vivian caught him standing over it in the evening, running his hand along the rail, his expression equal parts hope and dread. The baby came in late February during a storm that buried the world in 3 feet of snow. Silas rode through the blizzard to fetch Doctor. Brennan returning half frozen, but with the doctor in tow stamping snow from their boots in the front room, while Vivian gripped the bedpost upstairs and breathed through pain that felt like being torn apart and reassembled. The labor stretched through the night and into the next morning. Long hours of work and fear, and the steady low voice of the doctor, and Silas's hand in hers, his grip so tight she thought he might crush her fingers, and she did not care, because his hand was the only thing anchoring her to the world. And then the cry, thin and furious, and unmistakably alive. The sound of lungs filling for the first time. The sound of a new person announcing their arrival to a world they had not yet learned to fear. Dr. Brennan placed the baby in Vivian's arms. A boy, red-faced and squalling his tiny fists, clenched his eyes squeezed shut against the light. He was impossibly small, impossibly perfect. "He is beautiful," Vivian whispered. Her voice was wrecked with exhaustion and wonder. She touched his face with one trembling finger, counted his fingers, his toes, listened to the extraordinary sound of his breathing. Silas sat beside her on the bed, his arm around her shoulders, tears streaming freely down his face. He made no effort to hide them. He had learned this past year that there was no weakness in letting the people you love see what they mean to you. "What is his name?" Nell asked from the doorway. She had crept upstairs on silent feet and stood watching with an expression of awe so pure it made Vivian's heart crack open all over again. Vivian looked at Silas. They had discussed names for months, never quite settling. But now looking at this child she knew. "Ezra," she said softly. "Ezra Renfield." Silas kissed her temple. "Ezra," he repeated. "Welcome home, son." Nell climbed carefully onto the bed and peered at her brother with enormous eyes. "He is so small," she whispered. "Will he break? No, sweetheart. He is tougher than he looks." "Like you," Nell said matter-of-factly. Vivian laughed. The sound was weak and watery, but real, like all of us. That night, after the doctor had gone and Nell had fallen asleep, curled at the foot of the bed, like a faithful dog, Vivian lay with Ezra against her chest and looked around the room. The lamplight was low and golden. The cradle Silas had built stood waiting. And on the shelf across the room, visible through the open door, Ruth's handkerchief rested where Silas had placed it months ago. Faded lavender embroidery. R.E.W. A woman who had lived and loved and left too soon. Vivian looked at the handkerchief and smiled. This was not replacement. This was continuation. A family built on the foundation another woman had laid expanded and strengthened and made new by the people who refused to let love end where grief began. Silas was asleep in the chair beside the bed, his head tipped back, his hand still resting on the edge of the mattress near Vivian's hip. Even in sleep, he reached for her. Even in sleep, he stayed close. Vivian shifted carefully and reached for the carpet bag that still sat in the corner of the room. She had never unpacked it completely. Some part of her, some small frightened voice from childhood, had always whispered that she might need it again, that she might need to leave quickly, that this, like everything else, might not last. She opened the bag with one hand, the other cradling Ezra. Inside, folded beneath her few remaining possessions, was the letter. Orrin Sutley's letter. "I am a man of modest means but steady character. I seek a wife who values honesty and hard work. If you are willing, I will meet you at the station on the 15th of June." Vivian read it one last time. Then she folded it carefully and set it on the nightstand. She would burn it in the morning, not out of anger, not out of bitterness, simply because she did not need it anymore. The future it had promised was a lie. The future she had found was true. She closed the carpet bag and pushed it under the bed and felt something release in her chest. A tension she had carried so long she had forgotten it was there. The readiness to run. The expectation of rejection. The belief planted so deep it had become part of her bones that she was not the kind of person people kept. She was kept. She was chosen. She was home. Spring arrived the way it always does in Montana, suddenly and all at once, as if the land had been holding its breath for months and finally remembered how to exhale. The snow melted. The creek ran high and fast. Green pushed up through the brown earth, and the prairie came alive with wildflowers and birdsong. and the particular quality of light that only exists in places where the sky is bigger than everything beneath it. Vivian stood on the porch on a morning in late March, with Ezra sleeping in the sling against her chest. His weight was warm and solid. His breathing was steady. She could feel his heartbeat through the thin cotton, a tiny rapid pulse that seemed to her the most extraordinary thing in the world. Nell was in the yard chasing a butterfly, her laughter carrying across the open ground like music. She was 7 now, tall for her age, her golden hair flying behind her as she ran. She looked up and saw Vivian watching and waved with her whole arm, her face split with a smile so bright it could have lit the world. Silas was at the corral working with a young horse, his movements patient and sure. He must have felt her gaze because he looked up and across the yard their eyes met. He smiled. Not the careful, guarded smile of the man she had met on the platform 9 months ago. A real smile, open, undefended, full of a happiness he no longer tried to hide. Vivian smiled back and pressed her lips to the top of Ezra's head and breathed in the sweet, impossible smell of him. She thought about the girl who had stood on this same porch on her first night at the ranch hollow and frightened, certain she did not belong. She thought about the letter in her pocket, and the $17 and the carpet bag, and the long, terrible moment on the platform when the only man who had ever promised her anything turned his back and walked away. She thought about all the times she had been told she was not enough, not wanted, not worth the trouble of keeping. And she thought about now, about this porch and this house, and this man, and these children, and this piece of land at the edge of the world that had become, against all odds and expectations, the place where she finally stopped running. Home, Vivian had learned, was not a place you were born into, or a destiny someone else decided for you. It was a thing you built, slowly, painfully, one act of courage at a time. One choice to stay when everything in you screamed to run. One promise kept in the dark when keeping it cost you everything you had. The Montana sky stretched endless overhead, blue and deep and full of the kind of light that makes you believe the world is bigger than your fear. Vivian Renfield stood on her porch in her home with her family around her and believed it.